Hey there. Good morning. Kathy Spooner here. And I want to talk about today a couple of the things, actually three things over my last 30 years in mental health. Some of the things that I've learned that really have helped me get really great results for my clients. I think all of us at times in the mental health field, including the play therapy field, there have been times when we feel like, oh, I don't know what's going on, or maybe you feel stuck, or maybe you're still in the beginning phases. And I know I felt like a fraud all the time in the beginning. So maybe that's you. Maybe you sometimes feel like a fraud. I think most of the time, though, um, there are times in which we get lost. And what I've realized over the last 30 years, there are some things that I can do that really help me navigate that treatment process, navigate that clinical decision-making process from beginning to end, even in the play therapy field. And so a lot of the work that I do with play therapists that I supervise is really talk about the things that I'm going to talk about today to create that really strong framework for providing services to children, adolescents, and families. And so, if you're joining me today, I would love to know who's here. Go ahead and post your name in the comments. Where are you from? What population do you work with? How long have you been in the play therapy world? Are you using play therapy? Are you using other types of expressive arts therapy? Go ahead and post that in the comments. If you're watching on the replay, go ahead and post your name in the comments. Where are you from? What population do you work with? So I am Kathy Spooner. I'm a licensed clinical social worker and registered play therapist supervisor. I have been in the mental health field for the last 30 years. Um, I was introduced to play therapy when I was a special education teacher working with children with emotional problems in a self-contained classroom in the Northern Virginia area. That's where I was, and that was back in the 1980s. So I was introduced to it early on. And then that is actually the catalyst that made me want to switch because I've always wanted to work with children. That's always been a dream. I always knew, even as a little girl, I always knew I wanted to help kids. So when I found this play therapy thing, that was kind of a catalyst to have me go back to school and then eventually be able to find people that did play therapy to teach me how to do it. And that was a game changer, having some really good training and really good mentors to help you in the beginning get a really solid, firm foundation. It's a game changer. I highly recommend it. Even going along through the treatment process, I think it's sometimes helpful to get consultation with others just to kind of get another mindset. I know in the trainings that I do, I've been doing a lot of online trainings, live webinars these days. I've found that even when I always like to have small group interaction because the feedback that I get from those of you who participate is that really helps to hear what your colleagues are saying and what they're doing, get ideas from each other. That's one of the reasons I like the live webinars and I like the in person, but I haven't been doing those lately. I live on the West Coast now in a rural area, so they're a little hard to get to, which is why it's so nice to be able to do these webinars. Um, and I do have some webinars coming up. I have some supervision services and some webinars. I'll talk a little bit more about that. The live webinars that I have, I'll talk a little bit more about that at the end. If you're interested in some of the services that I do provide, to mental health professionals working with children, adolescents, and families who want to use play therapy, feel free to check out my website at rrhcounseling.com. All right, so let's get started today. I forgot to also say, I live stream every week on Wednesdays, 7 a.m. Pacific time. And I talk about all things play therapy and expressive arts. I live stream on LinkedIn, YouTube, and in my private Facebook group for mental health professionals working with children, adolescents, and families. If you're interested, if you're on Facebook, that's called Play and Expressive Arts Therapy Playground. You do have to answer questions to get in. So if you're interested, I live stream in those. I also now figured out how to live stream onto Instagram. So I simultaneously do that. So if you're interested, you can always watch the replays. They're easiest to find on YouTube or in my Facebook group. But I go live every week and talk about everything play therapy and expressive arts. It is one of my favorite things to talk about. I am super nerdy that way. I am loud and proud with my nerdiness. So today I want to talk about some tips to really help you get really good results for your clients. I know in the play therapy world, working with children, adolescents, mental health, we get into the field because we want to help people. That's the reason why we want to help them in the healing process. And it is hard sometimes. This is a hard job. It's a fulfilling job. It's a rewarding job. I would not choose any other job. I love the work that I do. And I especially love teaching other play therapists who are working with children, adolescents, and families. Now in my phase of career, I really love doing that. And so when I was thinking about some things that come up a lot in my play therapy supervision group, the online play therapy supervision group that I do, and in the trainings and just in my conversations with other play therapists, there are three things that come up a lot, especially in my group. And so I thought I would talk about those today because to me, these are really, really important and they're really, really helpful. They are kind of foundational. They are fundamental. And I think sometimes it's helpful to go back to some of our roots, go back to your graduate school days. You may hear some terms that are familiar and they may be dusty back there. So the first thing that I want to talk about is clinical conceptualization. What the heck does that mean? I first heard this term when I was supervising somebody. This was years ago. She was a graduate student at one of the universities. This is back when I was living in Virginia. And her field liaison said this term, clinical conceptualization. And then she explained what it was. And I was like, nirvana. Oh my goodness, my little inner nerd was just having a party. I was thinking, oh my gosh, eureka, this is it. So what is clinical conceptualization? If you're not familiar with that term, it's a really fancy way of how do you think about what is going on with your client? How do you, the way you think about what's going on with your client is then going to help you make decisions on a session by session basis, or when you're in between sessions and you have a minute to kind of think things through a little bit more. It's how you think about the change process from beginning, middle, and end to treatment as things come up. What are you going to do to address that? So it's a really important thing. And it's what we do all the time. We're actually in clinical conceptualization mode really all of the time. And sometimes I think we go on autopilot and then something happens with clients. We get a little stumped. Then we kind of have to take a minute and think about it. But clinical conceptualization is really the way that you think about how am I going to get my client from start to finish. And I read, I found this on LinkedIn. I get lots of good articles on LinkedIn. So if you're on LinkedIn, man, there's good stuff on there. So I read this article, and it's a psychotherapy networker. Oh my goodness, this was probably several months ago. But the essence of the article was how to avoid burnout in mental health. And this will tie in, I promise it will tie into this clinical conceptualization. And okay, so here, just full disclosure, I kind of, burnout is one of those words we talk about in mental health. It's important. I'm not going to say it's not important, but for me, I was like, whatever. I'm like, burnout just means you're going to tell me something else I need to do on my already busy schedule. Like, that's what I heard. But anyway, so and again, it is an important topic. So I'm not going to say that. I'm just saying, for me, like the term burnout, I was like, blah, one more thing. But what it did was it got my attention so that I clicked on the article, and essentially the article was about they interviewed the masters in the psychotherapy world, and they wanted to find out from these masters, how do you avoid burnout? And what they found was surprising to them. And I was like, yes, once I read it, I was like, I knew it. Yes, that's totally what it is. So what they found after talking to these masters in the play therapy world is the way that they are conceptualizing the treatment process. They are thinking about, from the first phone call, from the first session, how do I help my client not need to come anymore? Like, how do I help them successfully complete? And that's clinical conceptualization. That's my thinking about, from the very beginning, how do I help my client get from start to finish? And then my framework is, I like to call it my detective mode. So I'm constantly in detective mode of what's going on with my client, and how do I help them get past that? So it's really, really important to make sure from that first session. I find this happens a lot, that play therapists are not getting not all. I mean, some people do, but a lot I'm finding don't gather that full history. They don't gather that full psychosocial assessment. They don't ask about symptoms. They don't ask frequency, intensity, and duration. And when I supervise people, especially like even now, my supervision group, I did this a lot in Virginia when I supervise people. Frequency, intensity, duration. When you're asking about symptoms, ask about frequency, intensity, and duration. It gives you so much information. It seems like such a minor thing to do. You would be so surprised at what information that you get. But here's the other thing. When you get frequency, intensity, and duration around the symptoms, as well as gathering family history, if you're working with children, you also need to ask about parents and how they're co-parenting together. If they're divorced, how are they co-parenting? The parenting piece of it is going to be really important to gather that information. Any learning disabilities, get that developmental history, get any problems at birth, get the early developmental milestones. How did they transition into school? How did they transition from middle school into high school, from elementary school into middle school? These are huge transition points. And what I found over the last 30 years, especially, this came up a lot when I was working in residential treatment, that transition from elementary school to middle school, if it didn't go well, oftentimes there's a lot of struggle in middle school. And then if they don't get some of those things worked out in middle school, then it tends to take them into high school, and then they tend to have trouble launching into young adulthood. So those developmental stages, those developmental tasks give you really good information. Here's the other thing. We work with children and adolescents. We see kids in the playroom, and this is kind of bringing me back to my special education background. We actually can notice when there are some things that are off developmentally. Maybe we're seeing how they're holding the pencil, or maybe we're seeing those fine motor skills, or maybe we're seeing, how they're engaging, or maybe they're kind of their thought processing is missing a little bit than the typical developmental trajectories, like the typical. So then what that does is gives you the opportunity, because you're in detective mode and you're clinically conceptualizing what's going on with your client. Then you can actually begin to notice, I think my client I may need to talk to parents about getting more assessments. Maybe I need to refer them to an occupational therapist or a speech therapist, or maybe I need to refer them to a clinical psychologist to get more thorough testing to find out what's going on. These are the things when we are conceptualizing and we're making those decisions, we're catching these things, and we're starting off by gathering all of the information. And that's going to give you an idea of, okay, this is what's going on. This is frequency, intensity, and duration. This is family history. Let's just say there's a family history of generational trauma, attachment, and addiction. I know that means these are entrenched, long-standing family patterns. I know I'm probably going to need to give a lot of support to parents. I know I'm probably working through a lot of attachment issues, and core beliefs, thoughts about selves. So I already know these are things I'm going to be seeing in the play therapy process. And then I'm going to be watching how that changes over time. If I have frequency, intensity, and duration information about symptoms, that helps me gauge when they're doing better, or are they going backwards? If they're going backwards, then what's going on with that? That's my detective mode. So that framework in my mind is really, really important in your decision-making process. That clinical conceptualization guides you all the way through the treatment process. The second thing is having a framework that's grounded in theory and research. So as play therapists, here's what we know. We know that play therapy is grounded in theory, and that theory will access those therapeutic powers of play. Every play therapy theoretical model will have its way of accessing the therapeutic powers of play. Therapeutic powers of play are foundational to play therapy. It is what sets play therapy apart from those other expressive arts modalities. So here's what we know about theory. Theory drives application. My theoretical model is going to be the way in which I understand what's going on with my client. How do I define what the problem is? And then how does that define how to help my client fix the problem? For example, my theoretical models I've been trained in are child-centered play therapy. When I'm working with young children, there's a way in which I show up in the sessions. There's a way in which I talk in the sessions. There's a way in which I understand what's going on with my clients. And there's a way in which I write my treatment goals, my treatment objectives. The things we're going to be working on are going to be based on the way I think about what the problems are using a child-centered play therapy model. So if you're using like Adlerian play therapy, you're going to define the problem based and understand what it is based on that theory. And then Adlerian play therapy has a way in which they work through the problem, the way in which they define it, and the way in which they determine how it gets fixed. Gestalt play therapy, Jungian play therapy, all of these are going to be ways in which you define what the problem is, how are you understanding, and then how are you going to help your client heal? How is you going to help them fix it, so to speak? Most therapists, including in the play therapy world, most therapists, I think, will use more of an integrated approach. And I do as well. You can see all my miniatures behind me. I love sand tray therapy. A lot of my sand tray therapy training came from people who had more of a Jungian orientation when using that model. But I'm also trained in child-centered play therapy. The way in which child-centered play therapy modality will use the sand and the sand trays is very different from more of a Jungian oriented approach to sand tray. So if I'm using an integrated approach, then I'm thinking about what theoretical model I'm using, and then I kind of use it that way. The way in which I kind of wrap everything together with my integrated approach is neuroscience and attachment. I love neuroscience and attachment. So think about neuroscience. I heard this once at a attached conference like years ago. And the speaker was talking about neuroscience. I always love those. And she said, the brain is the boss of the body. And I thought, oh my gosh, that's so true. So think emotion regulation, using a neuroscience theoretical model, science-based, helps you understand just from a neurological sense, interpersonal neurobiology. From that sense, if you're looking at emotion regulation, which is one of the probably the most common reasons children come to your office, you're looking at emotion regulation. And if you're looking at it from a neuroscience standpoint, you're looking at the neuroscience of internal regulation. You're looking at maybe what is getting activated in their limbic system that's activating threat, or you're thinking polyvagal theory and you're thinking, okay, neuroception circuits, or maybe you're using interpersonal neurobiology and you're thinking those. I think Daniel Siegel talks about. I think there were 7 integrations. He talks a lot about integration with the mind and the body, where we're looking at like emotion regulation. Is it a sensory thing? Is it a sensory processing thing? And they're maybe getting overwhelmed by touch. Years ago, I had a little girl. She would get emotionally dysregulated all the time. And her mom described how the wind would absolutely send her into a panic and terror. So this is neurobiology. This is neuroscience. What we found was mom did a lot of research. I mean, this was like years ago. This might even be like 25 years ago now. What she found was there was this thing called sensory processing disorder, and her child had it. So her little sensory circuits were getting overwhelmed by the tactile sensation of the wind, and it would totally freak her out, to the point that if she looked out the window and saw indications that it was windy, like the trees were blowing, the leaves were blowing, things were blowing across the yard, then she would go into a full-on panic if they were having to leave the house. So I like using a neuroscience standpoint in that way, because to me, it really helps me to go into detective mode, think about, okay, from a neuroscience standpoint, what's going on with this? I also like using an attachment standpoint, because I think about co-regulation. Parents, guardians, caregivers are critical for helping children learn how to regulate those strong emotions. And the way that I kind of conceptualize, we know children are developing their neurocircuitry for emotion regulation. Initially, they're really having to use others to externally help them regulate emotions, which I would call co-regulation. So how does that look? Internally, let's say a 6-year-old is having an emotional meltdown, tantrums, maybe throwing things. We know their neurocircuitry is on full alarm mode. They're mad, or maybe they feel threatened. But we know at a 6-year-old, this is where conceptualization comes in as well. A 6-year-old's neurodevelopment is nowhere near what a 17-year-old's is or a 25-year-old's. So what we know is they're not going to neurobiologically have the capacity because they are really developing those internal neurocircuitry in order to regulate their behavior more effectively. So we know we need adults to come alongside that 6-year-old child and co-regulate, externally regulate. So that's the neuroscience and attachment framework of understanding what's going on with my client. But then now I have that framework that I'm using with my client, which is going to help me figure out, okay, what do I need to do? First and foremost, if I've got a 6-year-old and they have emotion regulation problems, I know their neurocircuitry is not very well developed. And so I know I really need to have parents involved to help them understand what co-regulation is, how important it is, and then probably teach them some skills about how to do that co-regulation so that 6-year-old can learn how to regulate more effectively. I also know that we can teach skills to them, coping skills, emotion regulation skills. We know, though, they're going to need their caregivers to help them use those skills when they're not in your office. You have that client in your office once a week. They are outside of your office a lot more. The real learning is going to take place in how they use those skills they've learned in the community, and that is going to require adults involved. So to me, if I'm using that neuroscience and attachment framework, then I know that's how I'm conceptualizing what's going on, and that's going to help me determine what that's going to look like in the treatment process and how I'm going to apply that theory. And then when things aren't going so well, then I can go back to that and I could say, what's going on? So let's say clients aren't making very good progress. Let's say you have a really challenging client. And if you go back to me, this is where understanding attachment, I know that relationship is key. I know that I need to develop therapeutic rapport and help them feel safe, feel heard and understood. I also need to do that with parents to get them in and help them make the changes that I'm asking them to make. So if I take a step back, that gives me a chance to think, okay, what's going on? Why are they stalling out? Okay, for my part, make sure I'm not doing any blaming. Make sure I'm not saying, oh, parents, this or that. I need to support parents, which is going to bring me to my next one. Parents are key. Engaging parents in the change process, guardians, caregivers. This is key. I need to form a relationship with parents because if I'm asking them to make some changes, then they need to know that one, I see them, I'm not blaming them. They always feel guilty. I need to make sure they feel seen, heard, and understood. They're going to make the changes I'm asking if they feel like I'm as much a support for them as I am for their child. And to me, that's where the attachment neuroscience comes in. Plus, it also brings in my clinical case conceptualization. I am engaging parents. I am meeting with them. I call it the fast food parenting approach, not the parents part of it, but the therapist part. Oh, I meet with them in the last 5 minutes of the session, we touch base. It's not going to be very effective. Maybe for some really highly motivated clients, parents, that will work. But if you want real lasting change, then you need to get parents into your office, typically in the beginning without clients present. And this is something I talk about in my supervision group and my trainings all the time. In fact, I do have a training coming up in November. It's attachment focused family play therapy. If you get the whole family in there, man, you get some good info. And this model, the attachment focused family play therapy, has a structure. There's a way of conceptualizing, walk you through all of the steps, because I think these are really important. The framework is like your roadmap. It's like your GPS to help you get through the process. That process needs to include parents at the very least, because they are the therapeutic agents of change for the clients. If your way of conceptualizing the problem includes the need to support parents, to teach them some effective skills with their client, they are going to be doing that outside of the sessions. That's where the real change happens. The other thing is that you're going to be able to help parents feel supported. It is a tough job being a parent. Still am a parent to two kids who are now young adults. They were not your typically developing children. I got the neurodivergent ones. These are amazing kids. They were hard. They were really, really hard. And as a play therapist, I felt like a failure all the time. So having some support is critical for parents, even if they don't have the neurodivergent kids. But you talk about parents who are generational histories of trauma, addiction, attachment. They need help. They need support. They need us to walk alongside them, to model attachment, to model co-regulation. They need us to model that to them. They need to feel heard and supported, because then they can make the change with their child. And they are going to be with their child way longer than you are. We are just a small blip in the life of our clients, ideally. I always try to be a really good blip in the life of my clients, but I am a small part. My job is to empower parents, to empower guardians and caregivers, to help them so that they could carry on the work long after they're in the treatment, ending the treatment. So that to me is part of my clinical conceptualization, doing that. That's part of my framework. And then I implement that. If we're just doing like a 5-minute checkout with clients at the end of the play therapy session, first and foremost, typically the child is hearing everything, which means are they really feeling private in their sessions? Secondly, it's never 5 minutes. It's just never 5 minutes. I've been there. I did it in the beginning. And then somewhere along the way, I realized this is not really helping to get where we need to be. And why is that? Because I remember feeling kind of irritated with parents. And then I had a little chat with myself. And I was like, self, why are you getting irritated? Like, why are you mad at the parents? And then I'm like, well, they're not coming in, this, that, and the other. And I think to myself, well, are you explaining this? Me having my conversation with me. Are you explaining? Are you scheduling? Are you having a conversation about how important it is? Are you expecting it? Are you telling them this is how you work? And my answer to myself was, no, I'm not doing any of that. So that's when I shifted my framework. I shifted my clinical conceptualization, and my expectation then from the very beginning of treatment is, here's how I work. Here's the expectation. We're going to meet at least once a month without your child present in the beginning. And I explain how that benefits them, because that's ultimately, we want them to know we're there for them. This is going to be helpful for them. We're not there to judge them. They always think we're judging them. And sometimes we are, though. So if we take a shift with that, engaging parents, then that's going to make a big change. It's also, I'm telling you, it will guarantee that you have less burnout. Because the other thing that I find therapists do, and again, I did this in the beginning until I realized, I'm actually contributing to the problem. We email, we text, we have phone calls, we do all of the therapy in between through text, email, and phone calls. For the record, I never recommend, I really don't think we should be engaging in clinical conversations via text or email with parents. I understand sometimes there are some exceptions for that. I think it's important to really try hard not to do that. It is not an effective way to do it. It is not an effective way to get that therapeutic rapport with parents so that they engage in the change process with you. A more effective way, which is a better use of your time, because then if they contact you in between, you say something like this, that is a really great point. I think that's a really important thing to talk about. And it's a longer conversation. So when can we schedule an appointment? When are you available? Here's when I'm available. When are you available? That takes your 30-minute conversation down to 5 minutes. And then now you've given them reason to show up in the family, in the parenting session. And it ends up being more beneficial for them. And you can help give them so much more support. So those are kind of my, those are my 3 tips. One is clinical conceptualization, how you think about the problem helps you figure out what your roadmap from A to Z, from start to end of treatment. And that is going to kind of determine what type of framework you're using. That's what theoretical model. I like using attachment and neuroscience because it's a way to think about the problem and also help me figure out what type of interventions are going to be really effective for my clients in that way. And then third is it's really important to have an intentional way of engaging parents as your partner. You are collaborating together. You are partnering. The goal is, and here's the clinical conceptualization and the neuroscience of attachment, the goal is that you're strengthening that parent-child relationship, parent-guardian relationship. That attachment relationship builds resiliency for your client, but it also builds in skills for your client's parents because they are the therapeutic agents of change that are going to be there long after you are in their lives. So those are key, to me, those are key things. If you're interested, I have an online supervision group. You can go on my website, find out more about that. I have set any of the trainings that I do. I'm always going to have a theoretical framework. It's typically based in neuroscience and attachment. And then that kind of, there's going to be some ways in which you're thinking about the problem. I think it's really important to do that because you can always learn like activities, like we're always doing that. I'm always doing that. To me, you have to have something to plug them into, like some kind of a framework that you're plugging them into. So I like to make sure any of the trainings that I do have some kind of a framework there. I typically use, actually, I say typically, but I always, all of my trainings, except maybe one, most of them have a neuroscience and attachment framework. I have an online course pre-recorded. I have some live webinars, and I also have supervision consultation. You can find those on my website. Coming up, oh, here's my website, my fancy schmancy little banner there. I do have a live webinar coming up in November. It's attachment-focused family play therapy. Here's the thing about family play therapy. I know when I say that, usually I'm in supervision groups and I'm like, oh, you should do this family play therapy. And the look I usually get is, woman, have you lost your, it's like a look of terror. comes on their face. Usually takes me a little while to kind of show them, hey, this is really a good idea. And I'll be there. I'll help you all the way through it. But if you get, you just heard me go on and on about why we need parents in there. Let me talk a little bit about why it can be helpful at some point in the treatment process to do family play therapy. This is part of my clinical conceptualization. I know I'm probably going to be doing that. Not always, but a lot of times I do. At the very least, I always have parents in there. And I meet with them at least once a month usually. So attachment-focused family play therapy, think about it this way. You get to see in real time what is going on in the family. And I like some flexibility because I don't like if I have to do like this, and this every single time for every single client. Kind of drives me crazy. I'm not very good at that. So I created this attachment-focused family play therapy model. So the model is grounded, the framework is neuroscience and attachment. And then it's got phases that you go through. How do you make decisions in each phase? The helpful, I can't tell you how many times I have had families come in and we do family play therapy sessions, and I get so much more information. I get good information too. I can see, oh, the siblings really are doing well together. And I don't think we do enough focus on work with siblings. So I think that's important. I can see how parents are managing all the different relationships. So there are phases that you go through. Part of this model is teaching parents attachment-based parenting skills. They're practicing in the sessions. There's a structure that you use from A to Z. So I do have this online training coming up. If you're interested, you can head over to my website. The training is going to be on November 5th. It is a live webinar. The website is rrhcounseling.com/courses. I typically have two versions of courses, one that has the continuing education CEs and one that does not have CEs, because not everybody needs the CEs. So it's just a way to get them a little less expensive if they don't really need the CEs. Most of us need the CEs though, so I want to be able to offer that. So I will see you next week, Wednesday, 7 a.m. Pacific time, and talking about all things play therapy and expressive arts. And I'll see you then. Bye.